collaborator from the Yes Men, and I'm assuming if you're here because you know some of their work, and there's way too much for me to try to cover, so I won't attempt to do that, but I'm really happy that Mike is here because we did some work together back in 1993, before the Yes Men were the Yes Men. I was the spokesdoll for the Barbie Liberation Organization. And so I've been trying to get Mike here. That was back in a different place, different time, different kind of work somewhat, and yeah, different names. And so here we are in Sussex, and it's taken me at least 2 years to convince Mike to come here and visit. So I'm really glad he could make it today, which is a weird time of year. So I'm really glad that you could make it today for the talk.
Thank you, Emile. And actually, that's my cue to begin with our collaborative project back in 1993. I figured that since I rarely get to talk about work from 25 years ago, this would be a great occasion since we're like here in the same place for the first time in years. So yeah, we both went to graduate school at UC San Diego, and in 1993 I had sort of arrived at UCSD with this kind of weird project in process, the beginnings of it, which was this switching the voice boxes of talking Barbie dolls and G.I. Joes. The Mattel company had released a toy called Teen Talk Barbie. This was at a very sort of important moment in the evolution of electronics, and chips for storing audio had become cheap enough to put in a toy, right around 1991, 92. So in around 93, there were lots and lots of new talking toys that were coming out simply because of the technology. There had already been lots of talking toys that worked with like little pull strings and had little essentially record players inside of them and other ways of making sounds. But this was the first time that you could really easily and cheaply use these recording chips. And so when Mattel came out with Teen Talk Barbie, one of the phrases that she said was "math is hard," which caused an immediate kind of outcry from a number of large organizations like the National Organization of Women. And Mattel sort of reluctantly apologized and agreed to pull that phrase from the future production of those toys. But I started like listening to what else they said, and it turned out that a lot of the stuff that Teen Talk Barbie said was almost as offensive as "math is hard," or maybe even more offensive depending on your perspective. So she said things like, "I love to shop with you," which let's buy some new school clothes. They threw in the word school, but still, it was this funny thing where the toy was actually telling the kid to go shopping for more accessories for the toy. So I thought this sort of inbuilt advertising and this weird model for consumption and kind of was this strange new innovation in in advertising, and so anyway, I got kind of I began. I would say I was upset about it. It was more like I got kind of began to feel a mischievous sentiment about it. And I started talking to my great aunt, who's a elderly at the time. She's dead now, but at the time she was pretty old. She looked like Yoda. She was like this 4 foot tall Hungarian Holocaust survivor. And she basically said, "I don't care about Barbie." I was telling her about this idea. And I said, "Oh." And she said, "Well, what about the G.I. Joe?" And I said, I don't know. What about the G.I. Joe?" So I went, and sure enough, since this was this innovation in the technology, there was a new talking G.I. Joe that also had this voice box. Not the same chip, much larger, because he had a much bigger chest than Barbie, believe it or not. And so then it became clear that there was an easy reversal that could be done, the surgery to switch the voice boxes. Anyway, I'm going to show a little excerpt from this film, this like half-hour video about the Barbie Liberation Organization, which you know, I found a bunch of willing collaborators pretty quickly as soon as I got to UCSD, including Emile. And this is what we pulled off. I'm going to show a little excerpt from a 30-minute video about this thing that's just here online somewhere. I don't even have a copy of it on my computer anymore, but yeah, here we go, right about here. By the way, even in the early 90s, the G.I. Joe, all the the comic book was about fighting people from the Middle East, which kind of astounds me that they had that kind of, that idea that was already being kind of implanted in the youth of America in the early 90s, 91, 92, 93.
We return now to the story of the Barbie Liberation Organization. Ed Day and the news team at our affiliate in Albany, New York, had the story first.
The Barbie Liberation Organization is declaring victory in their skirmish with the toy makers. Phil Bailey, who was live in our newsroom, first reported on Christmas Eve about the group's efforts to sabotage Barbie dolls and also G.I. Joes. Phil.
And on Christmas morning, the mission of the BLO is carried out by these 6-inch soldiers and a division of Barbie dolls.
The image of the American soldier, decisive, virile, and macho. What? G.I. Joe wants to go shopping? And that's not all.
I love school, don't you? Let's sing with the band tonight.
That was real funny.
Why?
Because it looks like, come on, fight me, except he says,
I love school, don't you? Let's sing with the band tonight. The teacher's the place for summer.
At first, 7-year-old Zach Zevlin thought this doll was a factory mistake, but it was soon discovered this G.I. Joe was in fact ambushed by the Barbie Liberation Organization.
Obviously opened it and it wasn't a factory mistake.
The underground operators left behind the surgically changed doll and a phone number.
You have reached the phone number for the Barbie Liberation Organization. The BLO is dedicated to the humanization of children's toys.
It's believed the stealth members of the BLO bought hundreds of G.I. Joes and Barbies, surgically changed their voice boxes, and then put them back on toy shelves around the country. This handout tape was provided to news organizations.
Hi, I'm Teen Talk Barbie, the spokesdoll for the BLO. That stands for the Barbie Liberation Organization. We're an international group of children's toys that are revolting against the companies that made us. We've turned against our creators because they use us to brainwash kids. They build us in a way that perpetuates gender-based stereotypes. Those stereotypes have a negative effect on children's development. In order to correct this problem, we have set up our own hospitals where we are carrying out corrective surgery on ourselves. Before surgery, me and G.I. Joe were forced to say things we didn't want to. Now we say things like this.
Dead men tell no tales. Troops, attack! Troops, attack that Cobra tank at the command post!
I donated my voice to a G.I. Joe because they want to be free too. They don't want to say all that violent war stuff. Now he says what I used to say.
Want to go shopping? I love school, don't you? Let's sing with the band tonight.
After we finish our corrective surgery, we climb back into our cartons and are shipped to stores everywhere, just in time for Christmas. We are now available in stores near you. Bye now. I've got to get in my box and off to the store.
I love school, don't you?
Zach thinks this G.I. Joe is definitely 4F, and so he plays with it differently.
like a detective.
Why a detective?
Because it's like in Murder, She Wrote, He's in disguise.
It's surprising and, well, men can say they want to go shopping. Want to go shopping?
He has one friend who came over and actually looked at the doll and said, he talks like a girl. Is he into weird stuff?
We're gonna get a Barbie doll in a clean house, holding cockroach poison, saying, "Dead man, tell no lies."
Wow, okay. That kid is now like graduated from college and everything. I mean, he's older than some of you. It's so weird looking at this again after 25 years. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, that whole half hour of tape is online, so you can look at it if you have any further questions. I was just thinking about how I frame this in relation to what I'm doing now. I mean, this action here, this whatever you want to call it, prank, this communication was really, I guess, the kind of shape-shifting and identity-changing that has come to dominate what I've done recently as the Yes Man, what you might be more familiar with if you are familiar with it at all. And so it really goes back to something that's fairly traditional, I think. I mean, often I talk about these things in an art context, and so people, interesting, that was the lights, okay. People, hey, people who have written about this within the contemporary art practice, where we got funding initially for this kind of thing, have described it as an innovation, but actually over time I've learned that it's just a traditional form of communication, and every culture has these stories of mischief, like the trickster characters in their mythology, and it's universal. It's basically every culture that has either an oral tradition that survived or a written tradition that emerged from an oral tradition has stories of characters or situations where people shift identity, change shapes, or engage in mischief in order to hold a mirror up to culture. It's a sort of standard way of communicating. And it's one that functions in interesting ways because there are moments where it often can reveal something in an audience that otherwise is invisible. It sometimes can make the invisible visible. And whenever you're involved in a culture, there are things that become invisible to you because they're part of your culture. And so that's why, I mean, today in the culture of capitalism, I feel like we need this more than ever. And I'm calling it the culture of capitalism based on what quite a few anthropologists are saying about global culture right now, which is that in a lot of places, like in the United States and the UK, we have a culture of capitalism that's replacing, in many ways, indigenous or traditional cultures, even the traditional nativist culture that, a nationalist culture that might emerge is really supplanted by a culture of capitalism most of the time. So there's certain things that become naturalized that we simply believe to be the way that they are. Like the idea that growth is good, which we don't really, I didn't really have to think about growing up as a kid. It was just understood to be that way. And so those sorts of naturalized things are I think, what right now really needs the mirror, or really needs a way of reflecting and talking about, getting it discussed so that it becomes part of the discourse that's questioned. And so sometimes using tactics that involve shock and surprise and sort of unusual ways of getting stories told in the media are required. Anyway, after doing this thing with Emile in the early 90s, which you can ask about afterward, for a number of years I ran an anti-corporate corporation called rtmark.com. Not going to talk about that right now. But, if anybody has questions, there will be a question period shortly. But then as part of the anti-globalization movement, I started working with this guy called Jacques, also known as Andy Bickelbaum. And we put up some fake websites that looked like the website one of them looked like the website of the World Trade Organization. And we started receiving email at this website. The WTO, which had an interest in being totally transparent, was actually very difficult to communicate with, which is maybe not too big a surprise. And so they did not have an easy way to interface with them on their website, whereas we did on our fake website. So even though people looked at our website, and if they'd read it, they would have seen that it was funny. We were just having fun writing satire about WTO policies, which turned out to be really easy to do because even though we didn't have any background in economics, all you had to do is start actually reading what they posted on their website, and you could see the absurdity there. And you know, the goals of the WTO as it was founded were to help business do business. This was literally the bottom line of the WTO when they were founded, and just after coming out of GATT, the Global Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, in the mid-1990s. And the belief system that existed in was this neoliberal kind of, in a way, fundamentalist idea that if you let money do what it needs to do, if you let people who have more money use that money, and if you free up the ability of money to do what it needs to do, then everybody will benefit eventually. And so this idea of letting the rich do whatever they want turned out to be very easy to parody. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It already seems like a parody once you read it. So we just were sort of highlighting it, putting up the website, but people, started asking us questions. Journalists would write in and ask us questions about Gibraltar and its relationship to the EU, and we had to answer, and so we got better at answering, and eventually we started getting invitations to attend conferences. And so for the first conference we got an invitation from was a conference on legal studies in Salzburg. And they asked if we could send the Director General of the WTO to speak. And we replied, no, we can't possibly send the Director General, but we would love to send a substitute. And so they accepted the substitute, and so then we showed up. And they thought that we were from the WTO. And we spoke on behalf of the WTO, again, imagining that our satire would become visible to the people attending, because this was a group of international trade lawyers. And so we expected that they would be able to identify that we were trying to make a joke. So the presentation that we gave included some sort of strange things leading up to eventually our punchline. For example, we said that the siesta in Spain should be outlawed because it gets in the way of work. And I mean, weirdly, we later found out that there were places in the world where they were outlawing the siesta. Like in Mexico, the government offices under the Fox government decided to abandon the siesta. Not just abandon it, but make it illegal. So it wasn't actually that far-fetched. But we were making fun of existing policies, like the idea of harmonization of business practices, which is a big EU initiative and a big initiative of the WTO globally. And so, anyway, the final part of this presentation was the WTO's proposal to open a free market and democracy by allowing people to sell their votes to the highest bidder over the internet. And so this cuts out the whole kind of confusing world of campaign finance and all the corruption that can happen in that confusing world, and inefficiency that happens there too, because really, if people can just sell and buy votes, it's the most efficient way imaginable to exercise democracy. And despite all that, the audience simply applauded, and they were very polite, and they took the business cards, and we had a lavish luncheon with them afterward, which was really confusing because we expected to leave basically in shackles. I mean, we thought we were going to get arrested. We had brought a video camera to witness this arrest, and somebody else who was there with us pretending not to know us was taping so that when we got arrested, they wouldn't get arrested too. And as it turned out, none of that happened. Since we were introduced as the most important, most powerful people in the room, even if somebody in the room had a problem with it, they didn't say. And in fact, everybody still wanted our business card. And so that sort of set us off on the, well, now about 17 years of impersonating people in power, and recording it, and sometimes turning the films of those actions into movies, into feature films. So we've done 3 features now at this point that all include this kind of impersonations, where we're usually impersonations, we're impersonating people in power. But that having been said, what I wanted to talk about now are sort of the 2 different ways that we usually communicate when we're impersonating people in power. I'm going to show some video examples of these 2 modes of communication. So one is the satirical mode, you know, sort of dark humor in the tradition of Jonathan Swift, who wrote A Modest Proposal in the late 1700s, quite a while ago now. And in that, for anybody who doesn't know, probably everybody here knows you, but I'll say it anyway. So his pamphlet, A Modest Proposal, was the proposal that the Irish eat babies as a way to survive the famine that was happening there. And of course, this was a political commentary on the fact that there was actually, that it was a forced starvation. It wasn't just a famine caused by a shortage of food. There was still crops being exported from Ireland. There was a shortage of money that caused the starvation in Ireland, the shortage of money for people there. So it was a, you know, what it ended up being was a, you know, way of subjugating the people of Ireland, and the rest is history. But he wrote this piece, this very famous, probably the most famous piece of satire in history about that. And I think it certainly has historically been an effective way to describe that power relationship. And so, anyway, the thing that we did with the trade lawyers in Salzburg was in keeping in that tradition, right? It's sort of like, and it's fun to do that. We had a great time like creating satirical interventions. I think I'll show you another one that we did later for fun here. Right. I think I'm going to show you this one. This next thing, this is an excerpt from our second movie. And this is an event where we're representing ExxonMobil and the National Petroleum Council. So we're basically being a combination of ExxonMobil and their petroleum lobby, and also the U.S. government, because this was in the last days of the Bush government, when he still had when there were connections, direct connections between the government and the oil industry. And the reason I like to, I'm going to show this whole excerpt from this film is that there's also a bunch of people who show up in this film who now are in our current government in the U.S. I mean, really fucking horrible people, like nasty, weird people. So there's a guy you're going to see in here, and also there's this, you're going to see a guy called Myron Ebell, one of the first people who appears on screen in the setup for this prank. And he at the time was with this organization called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And the Competitive Enterprise Institute was like the stupidest of the think tanks in Washington. And when I say the stupidest, I mean, it wasn't, I'm not just talking about them being kind of dumb. I mean that they were kind of seen as like the sort of strange weirdos, even among the right-wing think tanks. So if you talk to some, like these are guys who were hoping, they're kind of the bottom feeders of the right-wing think tank world. They were too extreme or weird to be in the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute or even the American Enterprise Institute, which is the famous birth of the neocon, you know, kind of think tank. So these are the big, shiny think tanks, and they're in this weird place in Washington and kind of dingy offices where, and they even met with us for our film. So that shows how desperate and strange they were. So, I mean, we filmed them, for this movie. we actually asked them, in case you're wondering when you see them, sometimes they appear before really weird like images in the background. That's because we asked them, we put up a blue screen behind them at their office and asked them what they wanted in the background while they were talking. So we're giving them what they wanted, which is a standard kind of market solution. Anyway, that's what that's what Mattel said they were doing with the Barbie dolls. You know, that's why they said math is hard, because they're giving girls what they wanted. They used focus groups to determine what they should say. Okay, so I'll show this clip. The other person who you're going to see in here is Lee Raymond, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, and of course, the person who inherited that job is Rex Tillerson, who is now Secretary of fucking State. Okay.
Now with the world's largest insurance company, AIG, on the brink of collapse, it could mean devastation way beyond Wall Street.
What other disasters weren't coming?
Global warming is silly. It's not a serious issue. Warmer is healthier, and warmer is more pleasant, and that's why states like Arizona keep gaining population rapidly.
There are benefits to global warming. Cold-related deaths will actually decrease considerably.
Just like with the subprime mortgages, our free market friends were doing all they could to stop government from intervening. Except here, the stakes were higher.
I think it's quite possible that if it weren't for groups like ours, that the United States might very well be in the Kyoto Protocol by now.
And if you've seen the ads that we ran about a year ago, which we produced in-house on this global warming, where our essential contention is carbon dioxide, they call it pollution, we call it life.
There's something in these pictures you can't see. It's what we breathe out and plants breathe in. Carbon dioxide. They call it pollution. We call it life.
We got lots of hate mail. 2 senators this past fall sent a letter to ExxonMobil calling on it to stop funding CEI.
So Exxon was secretly paying think tanks to tell us we shouldn't regulate Exxon. Public outrage forced Exxon to stop.
In fact, ExxonMobil didn't fund us at all this past year.
That was great, but Exxon had other ways to influence policy. Like this guy, Lee Raymond. He's a trustee of one of the key free market think tanks. He also used to be Exxon's CEO, and the year he left that job, he became an official advisor to the US government on energy matters. This was scary. If we let the free market cult keep running the world, there wouldn't be a world left to fix. We had to do something. So when we heard about a huge oil conference up in Canada, we decided to go. Posing as a big PR agency, we offered them Lee Raymond, Exxon's ex-CEO, as keynote speaker. They jumped at the chance. But what they didn't know is that on the day of the talk, Raymond would be suddenly unavailable, and an assistant would step in to replace him.
This keynote speech will attract substantial media coverage and will be one of the major highlights of Go Expo.
What would we do to shake this audience up? It would have to be more shocking than anything we'd done before.
If there's one thing that's going to be abundant in the world to come, what with climate change and all that, it's people, dead people. This is a pilot program to use that fuel. It's called Vivolium, and here we are, making Vivolium.
As Lee Raymond's assistant, Andy would announce Vivolium, Exxon's new biofuel to be made from the victims of climate change. And he'd even hand out a sample.
So it started out, we made one Reggie, and then we cast a bunch of Reggies in wax.
That's human hair right there.
This is a lot of experimenting to figure out how to make a candle smell like human flesh.
Ow!
I lost a Reggie.
Quick! Ow! We wanted to make sure that the oilmen knew what the candles they'd be holding were made of. So we'd show them a tribute video to Reggie Watts, a terminally ill Exxon janitor who had volunteered to be turned into fuel.
I think I'd like to be a candle. I think a candle would be fun because there's just so many uses for a candle.
There are 6 billion people on this earth today. We're probably using the energies, maybe, of 1 billion of those at best.
They had me test a Hellfire missile once. That was pretty cool.
We simply haven't found the miracle fuel yet to replace petroleum, but we'll eventually get there if government gets out of the way.
We had his miracle fuel, and our grandfathers were turning over in their mass graves.
CTV News with Barb Higgins and Daryl Chance.
Good evening. A bizarre situation today at the Go Expo Energy Conference at Stampede Park.
Organizers and hundreds of Alberta oil and gas executives got duped.
They've been promised a major announcement from a major player in the energy industry. Attendees paid $50 a head to hear this speech from the National Petroleum Council, a group that advises the White House on oil and gas matters.
Welcome to Go Expo's keynote luncheon. Please welcome Escape Wolf.
First, I need to say how wonderful it is to see on all the faces here today the childlike exuberance of a great industry in full flower. And why not? Without oil, at least 4 billion people would starve, and starving would become the new black. But I'm not here today to pat us all on the back. I'm here to speak of Plan Bs.
As Andy began outlining Exxon's tough solution to climate change, 10 volunteers passed out 300 human flesh candles. This vigil would be like no other.
Who first had the idea to use the oil of a recently living animal to light his or her house? Even today, Shetland Islanders cut the heads off their puffins and put wicks in the stumps to make candles. We at Exxon firmly believe that a free market will, if left to its own devices, always find solutions to the dilemmas that humanity faces. We're calling our new technology Vivolium.
As Andy began to describe Exxon's new biofuel, the candles were lit. A strange odor rose into the air.
What you see here is an artist's rendition of an advanced, large-scale plant. The Vivolium feedstock is renewable and unprecious, and it responds to the need of a shrinking market with greater supply. The dance of capital appears in full flower.
Finally, it was time to introduce Reggie Watts, the dying Exxon janitor who had volunteered to be turned into fuel. And now, we begin the tribute video to Reggie Watts.
Worked in maintenance for a while. Moved up to maintenance 2, started doing cleanup, toxic spill cleanup.
After I heard from the doctor that I was going to die, I felt like I had something to live for.
I think I'd like to be a candle. There's just so many uses for a candle. I mean, you know, like if you want to be romantic, like that'd be nice to know. I was a candle on a table, you know, people when they first met each other on a date. I think that would be great. I'd love that. That'd be a hoot.
This is a funerary observance. I mean, this guy died.
Switch this off.
This man died.
It's people. Really is.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much.
I'm very sorry, but we've been cut off. Apparently, we're not allowed to have a funerary observance for a man who's died to make a product possible. And I'm being, are you allowed to do that to me?
Reggie Watts is an Exxon Mobil employee, and these are actually 30 his actual 80%, I'm sorry.
20 is from what?
The remaining 20 is just, bonders, to keep it together. We have to think in such a case.
What is your credentials for that on mobile release? Sorry? What part is it on? So is that what that
Now, thank you.
Hey.
Shut it down. Shut it down. Now. Down.
Okay. Whew. All right. It's so strange watching that, whatever, it's like, gosh, it's almost 10 years or so, maybe more, 10 years after we did it, yeah, because Obama wasn't in office yet when we were doing that. It was still the Bush government. 2007, maybe, something like that. 2006 even, something. Anyway, and now seeing these guys, I mean, it's all the same people like in the current government. It's a little, it's not depressing. No, it's not. It's fine. It's all good. So anyway, where I wanted to go from here is, this is clearly an example of satire. But then I'm going to show you next what might be called a prefigurative action, or a scene where we use our power and authority to announce a utopian vision of a world that we'd like to see. And after a while of doing this kind of thing, we had discovered that since it was pretty much impossible to get audiences to react badly to us because they thought that we were very important. I mean, there's a bunch of psychological reasons for that. There's, behavior of groups, and there's also, trusting authority. There's all kinds of things that come into play that cause an audience to simply not react the way one might expect a decent thinking audience to react. But in the end, we decided that it might be more powerful to actually simply use that authority to announce the world we'd like to see. And so for the end of our first film is an action where we're representing the WTO, and we announce to a group of high-level accountants, like the type of people who hide money offshore for businesses, and we announce that we were closing the WTO and turning it into something called the Trade Regulation Organization with a new bottom line. Instead of having a organization that helped businesses do business, the goals of the organization would be to put business in the service of people and the environment. So to create regulatory frameworks that would, on a case-by-case basis, look at the effects of the business practices on the ground and then represent the needs of people who are the most impacted. And the idea was of the talk that we gave was to sort of get away from this free market fundamentalism that was really dominating the policy logic at the time, and to talk about approaches that would serve the needs of individuals in the environment. It's actually like a pretty simple framework. It's just as simple as saying, let's let business do whatever it wants. It's so anyway, we made that announcement that in this group of high-level trade accountants, and to our surprise, they reacted differently than they did for every other satirical announcement we'd made before it. Instead of reluctantly agreeing and coming up to get our business cards, they didn't really think about the business card thing at all. They simply asked how they could help. And then they actually self-organized into groups, working groups at the luncheon, because we said that we didn't know how it was going to happen yet, because we just received word, and we were the messengers and they were the experts. And they basically started to do it over the luncheon. So it turned out that this message about another framework was kind of mobilizing for them, even for people who we thought would be on the other side. But it turns out that, as one might expect, they all were working their job. They were if their orders turned out to be different, or let's say if the framework for the game turned out to be different, they were willing to still play. If they could still get their paycheck and still, let's say, suddenly make the rice industry, there were a bunch of representatives from the Australian rice industry, and if they could make it work in compliance with a new framework where it helped people, they were not just willing to do it, they were excited to do it. And they knew what to do, which was the other part, because we were totally baffled. I mean, we're just, so anyway, that was really liberating in a way. So we've now, sometimes we do an action like this because it's really fun. And we get to like create outlandish costumes and weird slapstick moments. But in a lot of ways, it's been more effective to use the opportunity to announce the world that we'd like to see. So I'm going to show the last scene from our new film. And this is also pretty long. It's 9 minutes long. So sorry, I'm going over the time that I think I said we'd use. But not very many people have seen this film. It didn't get distributed here in the UK. And so we're going to begin with this. Because this is sort of, again, that sort of utopian vision. It fits well with the other scene.
Yeah.
Get back in the saddle.
All right.
I mean, cheers.
Cheers. To saddle.
Yes. We knew there was a way to pull the plug on big oil. But we needed some help. Ever since we met Gates, we wanted to do something together. Posing as government bigwigs, we would infiltrate a Homeland Security conference and announce that the USA was outlawing fossil fuels and replacing them with renewables. And the best part? The new wind and solar power plants would be owned by native tribes as partial reparations for genocide.
To actually have white people wearing bands that say native headdress instead of a feather, a windmill, this is us making fun of the American ideal of what it is to be Indian.
This would truly be a second Thanksgiving. I told the conference that I represented General Colin Powell, and they were pumped to have him speak.
So our speakers are running just a tad late. We're not going to worry about it. General Colin Powell is coming to speak to us, and he's bringing a couple of colleagues.
General Powell, of course, would not show up, but his colleagues were nearly there.
Oh my god, you guys. Is this not gonna be a total giveaway?
No.
Is there a way to, like, maybe make it a little less like it is? Who's the other person?
Well, the Admiral, and he's followed by the Deputy of the Secret Service. So you've got two, exceedingly senior people.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to just confirm with them because it's so late. I'm beginning to wonder what's going on.
I'm Barbara Alexander. I'm so glad to meet you.
Hello. I'm nervous. Me and Tia are sitting down. We're trying to make small talk. You're trying yoga?
No, that shit. I need to. I'm having a hard time finding the yoga pants that'll fit.
He doesn't know, he's a scientist. That is a bad hair day.
These guys weren't exactly tree-hugging eco freaks. We had an aspiring Republican congressman, a 2-star general, lots of defense contractors, and weird security guards in trench coats. How would they react to an energy revolution?
Our first speaker is Undersecretary of Policy Implementation at the Department of Energy, Mr. Benedict Waterman.
On behalf of the Department of Energy, I'm very excited to announce today a great new plan that will do nothing less than convert the United States energy grid into one that's powered entirely by renewable sources. As the dire reality of climate change becomes more and more inescapable, people will take the future into their own hands And historically, we know that popular resistance is a force that can only with difficulty be countervailed. A revolutionary energy program today is easier than a real revolution tomorrow. By 2030, America will produce 100% of our energy from renewables, establishing us once again as a global leader in confronting the supreme challenge of climate change. We're excited to be working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and some of the largest tribes from Arizona to the Dakotas to site major wind and solar facilities that will provide a large chunk of America's power. The tribes will own these facilities. It will provide an enormous stimulus to the economy and great resilience in the face of future threats. It's time for a second Thanksgiving.
I am Dana Slowhorse. I'm the Director of Industrial Development at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I am a member of the Wennabe Nation. Joining me is my nephew here. He's a fire chief, war chief, a water chief, and he's actually also a midwife. He helps young mothers. There's a long sordid issue between the Americans and indigenous people. And it always hasn't been a beneficial relationship, at least not to us. For the first time, we have a voice, and we will own, truly own, this new energy production. And that's progress. And it'll build us a stronger economy, a brighter future. It will give something to our children. There's a lot of work done on Benedict's task, because we want to acknowledge and honor that. And so I actually went and killed a deer. I tanned the hide myself. Take this gift. Dramatically with minority peoples. We want to acknowledge the round dance. I encourage everybody to join us together. Just form a circle around all this if possible. All the way around? Yeah. We're going to go all the way around. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me. I composed this song for this occasion. I made it a simple song so we can sing it together because it's not just my song, it belongs to all of us. Way out here, way out home, way out home, way out here, way out home, way out home, way out here now, way out here now, way out home, way out home.
It would be worthwhile, I think, an opportunity perhaps, chat with you or your staff. Absolutely. Deem appropriate.
What kind of effect do you expect this to have on the share price of energy companies today?
This is ultimately going to benefit the economy tremendously.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
How many big are for you? About 3
sisters and
a lot of grateful nieces and nephews.
definitely.
So we're part of Northrop Grumman. We're a large business, but very interested to see how we can support this novel cause.
It's fantastic. So excited.
Yeah, this is outstanding. I feel really good. It's very emotional.
I was surprised to see someone from Northrop Grumman acting so excited. You weren't talking about weapons, you were talking about renewables.
You know, surprisingly enough, most people are not megalomaniacally insane. Even people who work for Northrop Grumman. And if they're given the opportunity to do what they actually believe in their hearts is the right thing, they go with it.
The fact that we could get all these people that we think of as being from the dark side that dance in support of renewable energy is that there are very few people who actually want us to continue on this fossil fuel path. And we have to force our leaders to actually do what we need them to do, and then people will follow.
Okay, so one of the interesting things about making a sort of utopian announcement is that sometimes, if it's done loudly enough, it forces the target to actually say something, to come to the table. This is one of the sort of exciting things about that mode. That's because if you're doing something that's satirical, it's still in keeping with the logic that already exists. It's not going to hurt them in any real way for there to be a rumor out there, for example, that, you know, ExxonMobil is making a fuel out of the victims of climate change. ExxonMobil is not forced to send out a press release saying that they're not doing that. Whereas if you announce that ExxonMobil is going to stop, let's say, extracting fossil fuels and going to invest entirely in renewables, they have to respond to that if there's a chance that people will believe it, especially if there's a chance that the market will believe it. And so we've experienced a couple of times where our actions were widely reported enough that they were picked up by traders or by computers that traded on the marketplace. And then, so for example, we made an announcement as Dow Chemical that they were going to clean up the mess in Bhopal, the site of the, you know, one of the largest industrial accidents or catastrophes in history. And their stock dropped $2 billion in 20 minutes. And so they had to say that they weren't cleaning up the mess. It forced them to react. So this is a way to kind of like, if you think of this kind of action as a form of storytelling, it's a way to draw the antagonist out and have them present themselves, really, and participate more actively in the story. We've done the same thing with GE. We announced once that they were going to pay back a tax bonus that they got from the government. This was actually in the year, I guess it was the year after the big market crash. GE was being paid money by the US government, even though they were making huge profits globally. They were doing one of these accounting schemes that made it look like they were losing so much money that they had to be bailed out. So anyway, this is the kind of, it's an interesting difference, I think, in terms of these two main ways of working that we have. So now let's go with the questions. Questions. I could start with a question for myself if you like. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm quite interested in the particular climate that we're all experiencing now.
Yeah.
Which has been sort of the kind of fake news, post-truth kind of era.
Right.
And I wondered how you felt this kind of intervention worked in a climate when people are believing the unreal already. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I think it sort of changes the environment to such a degree that, I'm just interested in what your take is.
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on where you are, I think, about whether these kinds of tactics are still useful. I mean, I think at the moment, at the moment they're a little bit strange because the level of tolerance for anything fake is very low. You know, I mean, I think if everybody has a kind of like low threshold of tolerance for, even for jokes. At least that's my informal assessment of it. One big difference between what we do and what the fake news industry does is that we immediately reveal that what we're doing is fake. Like as soon as it has enough attention, then we reveal that it's fake. And it's really in the reveal press release and in the storytelling about the reveal that we deliver the information that we want to, which we really carefully vet. So the goal is to essentially create a door, a sort of portal that didn't exist to deliver journalism, real journalism. And when we go through our reveal press releases, we're super careful not to exaggerate, not to, I mean, if there's a choice of statistics to use, you know, we did a project about the beef industry, and, you know, if you're calculating something like water footprint of beef, you know, the numbers vary wildly between what the industry says its water footprint is and what activists say. But even the industry standard figures are extreme. And so if we refer to those, like that's the kind of fact that we'd be really careful about, not exaggerating, not, you know, just like any real journalism outfit would have to do. We try to fact check our reveals really carefully because that's where we feel like the truth actually does matter. And what we've been doing is using this kind of trickery as a hook to get at something that's true. So, you know, that doesn't really address the problem right now, which is that we're in this kind of sea of fakery. But weirdly, we already were in a sea of fakery. It was just less visible. What happened, I mean, I think the watershed moment was when suddenly everybody could get in on the game of creating fake news. Like it had been really the territory of PR companies, you know, and the advertising industry, and to some degree government figures who had a big enough megaphone. I mean, I haven't seen in my lifetime anybody who cared less for the truth than Donald Trump. I mean, that's a very special situation. But there were lots of, you know, previous politicians who also knowingly did a lot of spinning of the truth. But a complete disregard for the truth was definitely there in the PR industry. So you have things like Hill and Knowlton, you know, a U.S. PR company that brags about how they meddle with international politics, including arguably starting or getting the U.S. involved in the first Gulf War, because they had this crazy theatrical event that they held in front of the U.S. Congress, this congressional testimony in 1991, where the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter reported an eyewitness account of seeing Iraqi soldiers take babies out of incubators and leave them to die so they could take the incubators home to Iraq, as if there weren't any incubators in Iraq already, you know. But this is a thing that was televised in the U.S., and the U.S. public believed it, even though the Iraqi ambassador's daughter hadn't been there at all, and the story was completely fabricated. It worked to get the U.S. to give George Bush Sr. The political will, and the congressional support to go to war. And the rest is history. But that's like the kind of meddling and the kind of, you know, fake news that we've had to contend with before this sort of ability for everybody to get involved. And I was just telling Emile before this that I was considering going to taking a trip down to this town called Velas, where which is in sorry, does anybody know this? Not in Montenegro, but in Macedonia. This little Macedonian town where hundreds of young people are employed writing fake news. I mean, employed as in they make like $5,000 to $10,000 a month, writing fake news stories that they place, you know, that they get ad revenue from Facebook and Google AdSense. So this basically, suddenly everybody can make fake news. And so it's become this kind of mercenary activity for anybody who doesn't have a job. You know, and it's a great job. If you're a Macedonian teenager and you speak English well, and you think like Trump supporters are really funny, you're going to be able to write some really funny, sticky headlines, you know, that they're going to eat up. And what they discovered was that the Trump supporters were typically way more willing to eat up the headlines and way more willing to believe an outrageous thing. And so that became the biggest target for this sort of fake news. But then, you know, Clinton supporters were equally targetable as well. So, and it's just a matter, then it's a matter of, I don't know if anybody does anybody here do this for a living? You could explain it to better than I will. But what you do is you take an existing story. So you don't want to do any work yourself. You can, but it's better if you just take an existing story and you figure out a really great clickbait headline for it, and then you can test market it. So if anybody's ever placed ads on Facebook, you can like say, okay, I wanna, you know, see if women in Dallas will share this enough to make it worthwhile to make me money on it. And so what you do is you take in an ad. The first thing you have to do is target it at those people. So you pay Facebook some money and to target that group. And then if that is a successful enough post, if you're making money against the ads you've placed, then you just go wide with it. And you just, as long as you have enough money to spend, you can just make more and more money as long as you are careful with the demographics. So you just test a bunch of clickbait headlines, write something even more sensational, and then once it's in those echo chambers, you know, people pass it around, and if it's sticky enough, you get some crazy stories out there, and you're just making money off it. It's kind of like, yeah, you don't have to, all you need is your little computer terminal and a little bit of seed money to place the ads. Because you can't really, that's another thing that, like, another, I think, misconception that most of us have about viral media is that it's going to be viral just because it's a good idea. Like on Facebook now, it almost always takes some ad revenue to start it to be viral, which is one of the scary things about Facebook and why Facebook is worth billions, is because suddenly everybody can advertise, and you have to. And once they get your network, even if you want all your friends to see your post, they want you to advertise. I mean, you have to push your post, right? So then it means like, you're gonna, pay $5 so that your friends see your Facebook post? It's some crazy shit when you think about how much that distributes this like industry that used to be just the provenance of, you know, these entities with a lot of money. So anyway, yeah, that's, so I was thinking actually, I'm thinking about doing a film about fake news because it does seem like I've thought about it a lot. And we've made a lot of it. It's just that we've made it in order to reveal it immediately, whereas most of the people in the fake news industry, which are people who make money off of the fake news itself, are never intend to reveal it. And the longer it lingers, the more money they can make. And if they're a company like Hill & Knowlton, they ideally never want it to come out. That story came out after about 2 years, but it was too late for, you know, to take back the the escalated involvement in, you know, the war. Too late to take back the war.
I'm just wondering, it was a great talk, thank you very much, and I love your work, I think it's absolutely brilliant. But I'm just wondering, you know, obviously you, like those people in the last film, you know, obviously people start to realise that the joke is going on, but I'm just wondering that I'm sometimes surprised that nobody recognises you, or nobody, because obviously Andy was wearing that wig there. I wasn't sure whether that's because he was trying to disguise himself because he didn't want him to be recognised, or just because it was funny, or what. So I'm just wondering, it's interesting that obviously you had this publicity, which is a whole intention, but it seems not enough publicity for people to say, oh, we know who these guys are fairly quickly, or to think, oh yeah, it's them. See what I mean? Or has that ever happened?
It has happened a little bit. I mean, interestingly, the Exxon one, where we're presenting the candles, there was somebody who recognized us, had seen, and we found out, we actually didn't know at the event that somebody had recognized us. We just thought that they figured it out because of the presentation and that they were trying to shut us down. But it turned out that there was a woman sitting at a table. We had lots of volunteers who were at these individual tables with cameras. And so later, months later, when we were going through the footage, we finally discovered what happened. Because there was a woman sitting there and she said, I know this guy. I know this guy. She kept saying it over and over again. And finally she said, I've seen him on TV. He was on Showtime or something, you know, something like this. And then she goes, oh my God, it's those guys. And so she takes out her phone and she's like, starts to text the conference organizers. And as soon as she does, she finishes. And then she goes, oh, shit, I shouldn't have done that. Because she wanted to see what was going to happen. And then she thought, oh no, I've caused this thing to be shut down. So then she was like, oh no, like, and so, but as it turns out, then it just took them so long to shut us down that we got to the end of the presentation anyway. And then when they did shut us down, it was much better for the film, because if it had just ended and nobody shut us down, there'd be no conflict. And so, so we also learned from that experience, well, that we always have to have somebody shut it down. And so it's important to try to make that happen at the end of the event anyway, because it just makes for better film. So that's a couple of, I mean, so it doesn't really answer the question, but it, I mean, it has happened.
Well, I think what you show so brilliantly is that people, you know, it's somebody they think is an authority or something, or is important or powerful, so they're just prepared to kind of suspend disbelief until
Yeah.
the very last moment.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, like with the wig there, I mean, I was as worried about the wig revealing just revealing that we were full of shit, you know, because it was such a bad, weird wig. I just thought, oh, somebody's going to notice the wig. They may not recognize us, but they're going to notice that he's wearing a really messed up thing on his head. There's a funny story behind the wig, actually. That wig was actually made by RuPaul's wig maker at 4 a.m. on the day that we were going to leave. So after he did a drag show, he made that wig. So between 4 and 7 a.m. And that all came about because we needed a really good wig, right? A wig that would really look like his hair, that would look really good. And so, yeah, right? Like, you don't go and ask like somebody who makes, you know, drag wigs for a really perfect wig. I mean, it's just, we had this kind of fucked up idea of what a really good wig maker would do. And since we happen to know this celebrity wig maker, you know, who made really outrageous wigs, we thought that was the right answer. And so because of that, we didn't go get a wig in advance. We just were like, and then, so the night of, the wig guy was like, oh my God, I forgot to make the wig. But I'm doing a show. So it was this whole kind of fiasco. And then he hadn't taken the wig out of the box until the day of in the car. He gets the wig out of the box because the wig came in, and that was the first time he tried it on. So it was all, yeah. And then there was a whole debate about whether or not he should wear the wig. But ultimately, the wig is funny. And so, yes, of course he should wear the wig because we're making a film as well. And so it's not like what we're doing is, yeah, it's for the audience that's there in the room, but really it's for the, let's call it there's three audiences. There's the primary audience in the room. They kind of matter because they play a role in it. But then there's the secondary audience who see it in the like daily press or the, you know, television news. And then there's the tertiary audience who watches it in a film. And really we're doing these things for the film audience because we find that that's where the ideas sort of have the most amount of stickiness. It's where it sort of sinks in. We get to put it into a broader narrative. And it's what people tend to remember and talk about. The interventions we've done, even though they've gotten tons of press, they don't always stick with people. Like even this thing that I mentioned where we made the announcement about on the BBC, on BBC World Television, about Dow Chemical cleaning up the mess in Bhopal. It played on, you know, every TV outlet here. It played in heavy rotation for days here and all over the world. And a year later, we went around interviewing people on the street in London about it. And there was maybe like 1 in 10 that remembered. But people who watch our movie, which is admittedly a very small segment of the population, they not just remember, they kind of like talk about it, talk to other people about it. The ideas seem to have more, I don't know, it seems to work better as a kind of a pedagogical and a tool for discussion. Yeah. Barbecue's getting good.
I guess there's a certain acceptance of satirical behavior in Western society, in Anglo-American culture, and so on. You mentioned Swift, maybe Carnival historically. This permission to lampoon seems to be sort of built into the system, but I'd be interested in knowing whether culturally, on a global scale, the same kinds of activities might lead to similar kinds of responses. I know from little bits I've read that in Iran there's also a kind of tradition of that sort, and it can lead to serious repercussions in certain situations, for example. So it strikes me as interesting to kind of wonder about that as well, and how if you were, for example, to employ these methods in China or elsewhere, what kind of approach would be needed, and what would the effect be?
Yeah.
Seen as amusing?
Yeah, it depends. It definitely differs from place to place, and it's interesting you brought up China because I don't know very much about that. I know that there are places like Burma where there are like very active traditions, and there's been a lot of repression, and comedians end up in jail for very long periods of time. But there are, in situations where this sort of activity is really taken seriously by the authorities in such a way that people are, imprisoned or, worse. There are ways that emerge for people to deal with it. Like there's a book called Small Acts of Resistance that is full of examples of places that are where this kind of creative activist practice finds a way of working despite very repressive conditions. So speaking of Burma, that's like an example of a place where for quite a while people had a very hard time expressing themselves in these ways publicly, but sometimes would find another vehicle for doing it. So for example, there was this thing for a while where people were putting pictures of the sort of dictator on the collars of dogs, and sort of like so, and the dog is seen as being quite dirty and sort of, and so by having this, the dogs became activists. It was conscripting dog armies, and so these dogs, nobody could tell who was putting the things on the dogs, so you couldn't target the individuals, but people understood still what it meant and saw it as comic, essentially. It was like a way of it's that as a way of also making the resistance visible, because if there's so much suppression or oppression of resistance that you don't know who among you is actually resisting, then it becomes very hard to build solidarity. And so that's like one of the subtle tactics in a place where there's really a lot of control being exercised. But I think that book, Small Acts of Resistance, does a pretty good job of kind of framing that exact problem and goes around to a few places in the world. And sometimes it just becomes the way that people engage becomes quite different. Like this type of thing that happens in Russia now. In Belarus, there's like all this. There's a lot of really comic resistance in places like that, but it's it tends to be way more in your face than it's not particularly subtle usually. That's also cultural. I don't, yeah.
Thank you. I guess what occurred to me when you talked about the ways in which you do this is like satire comes from, it builds on cynicism that people have. So you can say really terrible things, and up to a point people are willing to go with it because they're willing to believe that people are actually terrible, and they're going to be asked to do worse and worse things. And I wonder whether over your career you've seen that cynicism change, or whether there's more cynicism around now because there's more polarization, there's more tolerance to stuff that you may not think is true, but it's still being set down. So is there an intolerance or a cynicism that grows or gets less?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I mean, maybe I feel like there's less cynicism. I mean, I don't know. I feel like the 90s in the U.S., from where I come from, cynicism like reached a peak in sometime in the mid 90s. And then there's this weird kind of like sincere, I say weird because I was like, I don't know. That's when I was being really cynical. But then I think in the post 9/11 period for Americans, things got less cynical and more serious and more kind of, I don't know, like I teach university students who seem quite sincere and serious today, much more so than we did in the 90s. There's also, there's this, I see a difference between cynicism, I guess, and the idea of a kind of optimism about the future. I mean, there's not a lot of people I know that are really optimistic right now, but there is definitely a kind of a sincerity, like a sincere desire to shift stuff, more than I've seen in maybe my lifetime in the U.S., which is, I mean, that's also about the sort of political will or the, you know, I think people really feel pushed to the edge. And so in that way, there's a mobilization happening that's, I think, quite positive and really hopeful and not cynical at all, you know. And that, I think, is, that's maybe the, there's no silver lining to this Trump situation, but that is perhaps something that's, you know, in the long run will work out well, I hope. Yeah.
Do you have a sort of utopian hope for what you do? I mean, it's in terms of like thinking about the tertiary audience. Like, do you imagine? Do you want people to go and do what you do, or do you want like? Because this is like totally sincere. When I saw the Dow thing, I was like, wouldn't it be amazing if Dow actually were forced into the position where they had to make reparations? You know,
yeah.
When you think about what you're doing, like in some ways, this is asking you who do, like you guys who do this great stuff. Like, how do you maintain optimism? Like, how do you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm taking a little break from it. Actually, right now, I'm in the middle of. For the last 2 weeks, I haven't had a project that I'm doing. You know, I finished the semester teaching about 2 weeks ago. And then for these 2 weeks, for the first time in 20 years, I haven't had like a project that immediately like needed full attention. And that's in part because after this Trump situation, right, there's this, the way that we'd been working for the last, let's say, decade has been to try to do these kinds of actions timed for campaigns of organizations or movements that have a chance of influencing policy at particular moments, right? So the idea is that there are all of these organizations that are competing, let's say organizations, or all of these campaigns that are competing for attention of the public. And then if you get enough attention at the right moment and enough public outrage, that can translate into some action by the government. But that's totally broken in the US right now because there's no amount of attention that's going to result in action by this government. They're not responsive to normal democratic channels at all. And so in the wake of that, I'm like in the process of reassessing, like, what do we do? You know, what we've been doing, which is teaming up with these organizations, doesn't really make sense for the moment. There is a movement that is emerging and we may be able to fit into that in some way, but I don't know what that is yet. So I don't know if I'm really answering the question. I mean, eventually, I think the goals of our work is sort of like what you see in some of these actions. It's like, let's, you know, have this renewable energy future, you know, where owned by Native American tribes. You know, sure, why not? it's actually not, it's not at all impossible. It's like totally doable in a way. It would take a lot of political will. But so in a way, that's by doing these utopian actions, that's like saying, okay, what is the goal? What is the goal for the form of what we do or for the practice? That I don't know, and I guess maybe this is a point to refer back to the beginning of this thing today when I was talking about this being a kind of universal way of humans communicating, universal or timeless. It's a, you know, as long as I can still enjoy doing it, maybe I keep doing it because it seems to be what I've just done for most of my adult life.
It would like occur to me that the other problem with Trump, like the other side of the fake news, is that he actually, like it's not like Jonathan Swift, right? Like we all know that, you know, they want the Irish to die, but nobody's quite saying it, and then he says it. And that's kind of what you guys do is too, but now Trump is saying it, right? Like everything's, there's a way in which a lot of things are just kind of out there.
Yeah.
And I can see how that also gets in the way of satire if like, you've got people saying like, let's eat the Irish children who are the president, that's what the president of the United States is saying. What does, you know, which is practically what it feels like right now. Where's the, yeah, like, so anyway, this is just me.
Yeah, no, it does feel like the end of satire, but at the same time, there's some really good satire out there, so I don't know, you know.
This is not to say that this isn't, you know, what you do isn't great. But
No, I agree. I mean, I feel like retiring. But yeah, it's that part is it is actually. I haven't done enough kind of thinking about where things are going in the future, and I mean this question about what's happening right now with social media. I mean, it's kind of amazing how this how social media sort of got spun as this revolutionary way for us to communicate with each other, and even was, let's say, lauded as the thing that sparked revolutions, even though that was part of the PR campaigns of those companies that had the money to promote that story. But now, I mean, what we're finding is that they, you know, they're a good way to sell things and to map us out, but they might, in some ways, actually be causing or part of a media landscape that is, you know, fracturing our ability to communicate with each other, polarizing us, because suddenly you don't see anybody else. I mean, I don't know if it's suddenly, but it seems to exaggerate something about what is visible and invisible in the culture around you. At least that's my. I mean, I went through a real weird schizophrenic election cycle because I live in upstate New York, in the countryside, and right now in the U.S. it's like there's urban and rural, and urban people are overwhelmingly in support of, you know, kind of like social democratic, kind of at least centrist, Hillary Clinton-esque or whatever. Let's say just the Democratic Party status quo shit, at least, if not more progressive. And then in the countryside, people are overwhelmingly right-wing, like massive quantities of people, like 80%, you know, sometimes 90% right-wing. And so I was living up there in the countryside. I grew up there, and I was surrounded by Trump signs everywhere. And I'd go into the city, and I'd see my friends there, and I'd be like, it's fucking going down, man. This shit's happening. And they'd be like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Nobody supports Trump. Nobody at all supports Trump. Don't worry about it. We're fine. You know, and so, you know, and I'd go back up there, and then it was also like, I could see like behavior changing too. So there's people with their Trump signs who are like, a lot of them were like my friends-ish. We're suddenly like, really like weirdly aggressive too, even with like me and with whatever you know, and I'm like, dude, you know, like I grew up with you, and you know, Like, what are you doing? It really felt like that. There's a real sort of strange disconnect. Incidentally, I figured out that the way to talk to them was by bringing up marijuana, and then we found there was a way. Because everybody smokes pot, it turns out. I know. I'm serious. It's this weird thing like young people, young right-wingers in the U.S., the country boy right-wingers tend to be like real serious pot smokers. And so that's like but that's what you have to do. You have to find common ground through that, and then somehow open a conversation where you didn't need to have a conversation. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I didn't need to have a conversation about politics with any of these guys or women because they saw themselves as fundamentally apolitical. They didn't want to deal with it at all. They're like, don't want to talk about it. All I want to do is hunt and fish and go to work, whatever, cutting down trees, whatever their job is. Seriously, like lumberjacks. Yeah, it was a pretty good life. And we were cool. And now they're like suddenly like a lot weirder. Like, not all of them, but quite a lot of them. So that was the reality that I was seeing there. And the thing that had changed, the thing that was different, was that they were all getting their news off of Facebook. They were all getting their news from Facebook. So these same people, my friends who I'd grown up with, who might have occasionally read the newspaper before, were now educating themselves on Fox News and fake news and radicalizing.
Sounds like a great new territory for whether it's satire or some other new version.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think we're all going to have to be careful about this. I don't know if everywhere else the world is dividing into urban and rural the way it is in the U.S., but take a look at the electoral maps in the U.S. And the problem with the U.S. in particular is if there was a war between urban and rural would kick urban's butt because all these people are armed to the teeth in the rural areas. This is like, the U.S. is the most armed country in the world in terms of, even in terms of like people owning small arms. But most of those arms are concentrated or distributed in the countryside. That's where people own 5 guns and make it look like everybody in the urban areas own a lot of guns. And they also, actually use them so they know how to use them. So it's a little different than, so we don't want that to happen. There can't be a revolution. There can't be. It would be really, the outcome would not be good, So like my dad, my father, he's a Holocaust survivor, and he gets really frustrated because he came to a presentation. I organized a thing where this anarchist friend of mine gave this presentation about punching Nazis and getting training to punch Nazis and getting people armed and practicing. And my dad's just like, I've been through this in the 30s, man. It doesn't work because like the people that was a time when everybody wasn't already pre-armed. They still had to arm the militias. They still had to arm the paramilitaries. And even then, the odds were stacked so highly against these like urban people that it never would have worked. They have to find a different solution because, today it's like it's so fucked up. The countryside is so heavily armed, and the so-called intellectuals or the Jews or whatever you call the people in the cities, brown people, immigrants. These people are people who are not really like ready to have an armed battle with like a bunch of hicks who know how to shoot. I'm a Hicks, I'm kind of a hick. I grew up there. I say it most fondly. I love driving around in motorized vehicles, shooting stuff, and drinking. I don't like country music though. I draw the line there.
So that seems like a good point to kind of wrap up the formal part of today's presentation. But obviously, if you want to ask Mike more questions, then you stick around or, throw them in his direction, but why don't we give a round of applause?
Thank you.